Okay, hello everyone, and welcome. I'm Kim Schwenk. I'm the liaison to the Bibliographical Society of America and Lux Mentis Booksellers, and I'm happy to open this fair with the first set of lectures today, co-sponsored by the BSA and the ABAA, so thank you very much to both. And so before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to say a few words about the BSA, and if you're interested in becoming a member. Please visit our website. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get the brochures in time from New York, but if you have any questions, please visit the website, Bibliographical Society of America, or bibsocamer.org, or you can come find me in Lex Mentis booth if you have any questions. So a brief mission statement about the BSA is we are an international, interdisciplinary, scholarly organization that fosters the study of books and other textual artifacts in traditional and emerging formats. BSA pursues this mission by hosting public programs like this, funding scholarly research, conferring awards, issuing publications, and collaborating with related organizations. The Society is committed to adopting policies and procedures that support and promote equity and inclusion in all of our programs, and to provide equal access to our events and electronic resources to people with disabilities and other access needs. So this is one of the things that we love to do, public programming. So I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Jullianne Ballou. As the first Warren Winiarski Fellow at UC Davis Library, Jullianne Ballou curates the library's Wine Writers Collection. Previously, she led digital projects at the Harry Ransom Center, including projects to digitize and build online archives of personal papers, photographs, and creative works of Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Dylan Thomas. She became interested in literary collections while working as an editor of the Oxford American Magazine, and before that, with the University of Texas Press. She currently lives on an almond orchard in Woodland, California. Jullianne will be speaking on the title, Good Words Make Better Wine, Building the UC Davis Library Wine Writers Collection. In 2018, UC Davis Library began to expand its wine writers collection that includes the papers and electronic files of people who have written or podcasted about California wine from the 1950s to the present. These archives and the ephemera they include extend the literary works in the library's circulating and rare wine book and manuscript collections, which date to the start of the 12th century. UC Davis's wine library documents the evolution of a genre and of a drink that's both agricultural product and art. So I welcome you to sit back and listen and learn about what the collection holds and about its development and evolution over the last 3 years. And if you could refrain from questions until the end, we'd be happy. We have a little bit of time, and we'd be happy to take questions. And so please welcome Jullianne.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's an honor to be here, and I have a lot to say, so I'm going to read from my talk, and I love to have interactive conversations, so I sometimes hate to hold questions until the end, but I'm going to try to leave plenty of time at the end of this talk to answer questions, so please think of some while I'm speaking, and I look forward to having them at the end. So it is an honor to be here. I've given talks and presented at conferences before, but it's a special and unique opportunity to stand in front of an audience of book lovers and book experts. I feel a little unworthy, but the collection I'm here to talk about, the UC Davis Wine Writers Collection, is very worthy. And so is the UC Davis larger wine collection, which includes the papers of wine institutions and wineries and winery owners, and spans both the special and circulating collections. And my colleagues Axel Borg and Christine Chang will speak in more detail about that collection after my talk. So I'd like to take this time to talk about the Wine Writers Collection, where it came from, what it has turned into, and I hope you are interested in what I have to say. So before I get into the origins and evolution of the collection, I want to say a little bit about the genre of wine writing and about what the term wine writing signifies at the library. My colleagues and I have interpreted the genre broadly so that wine writing can encompass as many forms as, say, food writing and music writing. Wine writing includes historical writing, criticism, journalism, and in some cases, creative writing. It occasionally includes science writing, but we've drawn a line at hard science, or writing that's both scientific and academic. Where it maybe differs from other literary genres is that the term wine writing is also popularly used to describe wine marketing and PR, and there is sometimes an uncomfortable degree to which the writing is influenced by the free market, in my opinion. How many other literary genres can you think of that include, as part of their lexicon, a rating system, where numbers are used to deliver information more quickly and efficiently than words? This is one of the most, at times, maddening characteristics of the genre for me, that it ranges unselfconsciously between poetry and propaganda. But then perhaps that's befitting a writing used to describe something that so perfectly embodies human desire. And that has been such an integral part of human civilization for thousands of years. As the drink evolves with its culture, so of course does the language used to describe it. I'd like to read to you 4 excerpts of writing by contemporary wine writers with notably different styles. Here's Gerald Asher in his book On Wine, first published in 1972. There was a time when weekly shipments to the bars and cafes of Paris absorbed much of the production, but that demand seems to have disappeared, along with the Art Nouveau decor, to which a glass of Vouvray, it must be admitted, once added a shimmering dimension. Vouvray is a period wine with an intrinsic style that is not always in accord with popular sensibilities. A white wine that needs its modicum of sweetness to be in balance and some age to show its quality meets resistance when the first duties of a modern white wine are to be dry and young. Now MFK Fisher, in her preface to the Book of California Wine, published by UC Press in 1984. I can no more think of my life without thinking of wine and wines, and where they grew for me, and why I drank them when I did, and why I picked the grapes, and where I opened the oldest procurable bottles, and all that, then I can remember living before I breathed. In other words, wine is life, and my life and wine are inextricable, and the saving grace of all wine's many graces, probably, is that it can never be dull. It is only the people who try to sing about it who may sound flat. But wine is an older thing than we are, and is forgiving of even the most boring explanations of its élan vital. Here's Karen McNeil describing a 2019 Douro Valley port in her e-newsletter, Wine Speed. This is from a newsletter that was sent a few weeks ago. Quinto do Vesuvio is one of my favorite vintage ports. It's breathtakingly complex. A powerhouse of cool, spicy, blueberry-esque flavor, and has a double velvet texture. It also fairly vibrates with aliveness. Quinta de Vesuvio, founded in the mid-1500s, is considered by many to be the most magnificent traditional estate in the Douro Valley. This is a must-taste to believe wine. Now's a great time. 98 points. Finally, here's something Miguel de Leon wrote in his article, What Does It Mean to Make Wine Right Now? For Punch Magazine in August 2020. Historically, it has not been the industry's default position to speak about political things. It prioritizes the marketability of a particular winemaker's point of view, or the low-key but significant endorsement from a media personality. It prioritizes eye-catching labels, or the low-key but it prioritizes eye-catching labels and bottle rarity. However, what we're seeing now and can't ignore is the industry's complicity as it continues to suppress othered voices, distance marginalized populations, and shame victims and survivors of abuse. In complicity, no one has been asking about the human costs associated with wine, whether through labor practice or the moral principles of its makers or the ethics of its vendors. Asher's writing is primarily concerned with aesthetics. Fisher's is deeply personal and somehow universal at the same time. McNeil seems to be interested in making a sale, and De Leon addresses the political consequences of prioritizing aesthetics and money over the people involved with making and selling the wine. If you caught it, two of those comment on wine writing. Very meta. What do these different forms of wine writing tell us about wine's place in society? So at the UC Davis Library, our goal has been to collect wine writing in all its forms so that researchers now and in the future can tell us why wine seems to matter as much as it does. Now let's get on to the collection. The seeds for the Wine Writers collection germinated long before I arrived at UC Davis in January 2019. The library was already home to the papers of 4 California writers who had been among the key players in the mid-20th century decades, when this state's wine industry was moving from tender and in recovery from prohibition to stronger until it was an open part of our culture and our markets again. The writers were Charles Sullivan, Roy Brady, Bob Thompson, and Leon Adams, and they presented wine as one nuanced part of the American story with its own cast of characters that were working and being worked by the conditions of the land. There were the protagonists, the winemakers, with their heroes' journeys, and the wines, which were often anthropomorphized. They were beautiful and broad-shouldered, and they were also products of labor and striving in the fields and in the cellar. They had characteristics and were sometimes described in terms of their typicity, the degree to which the wine tasted like the grape that had made it. But often flavor was just one part of the larger story of a wine's provenance. And often that was part of the story's bigger overt and covert questions. Was the wine American, and what did that mean? And was it as good or better than wine produced in France and Germany? The writer's manuscript collections consisted of everything you can imagine that a wine writer would use and save in the course of their work. Wine labels, menus, wine lists, sketches on napkins, articles and book drafts, and more. Leon Adams' collection includes hundreds of notes that he typed up after meetings with winemakers or after he'd followed dubious directions to the site of some long-forgotten winery that existed before Prohibition forced it to close its doors. Much of his archive is information that he collected while he was researching and writing the seminal Wines of America, published in 1973, which is a wide-lens view of wine growing and winemaking over centuries of wine production in North America. My favorite part of Charles Sullivan's archive is his correspondence with the English professor and Kipling scholar Tom Pinney, also one of the state's greatest wine historians. His papers are at Cal Poly Pomona. The men had an epistolary friendship, and their letters are colorful and rangy. The topic of wine is woven into conversations about music, movies, art, and food. There are the personal topics as well, and from their letters, we understand who these men were and why they wrote what they did. Thompson was sometimes the California counterpart to the British wine writer Hugh Johnson, original author of the Wine Atlas. He may even have been Thompson's California Inn. The two wrote the California Wine Book together in 1976. These 4 wine writers' collections were a bright spot in a very large collection of contemporary and rare wine books and ephemera that had been collected since 1880. when the state of California created the Board of State Viticultural Commissioners and charged the University of California to do research in the area of viticulture and winemaking. Then in 2017, British wine writer Jancis Robinson donated her papers to the library, and shortly after, in 2018, Hugh Johnson donated his. The writers who've achieved international celebrity in the wine world brought new respect to the library's wine collections. While there's an established tradition of collecting literary manuscripts in the US, no institution up to that point had collected wine writers' papers in a focused, strategic way. Robinson's and Johnson's donations would change that. Both writers knew of and respected Brady, Adams, Sullivan, and Thompson, but those writers were of a time, and time has not stood still in the wine industry in California. Everybody in the world with any invested interest in wine still knew who Robinson and Johnson were. Or if they didn't know Johnson, they knew Robinson, who still writes prolifically and has a strong and ubiquitous presence online. So what happened is after Hugh Johnson and Jancis Robinson donated their papers, that was like a bold and both self-serving and visionary move. Because in that move, they had enough weight as writers and as wine personalities that they basically said, like, why not collect wine writers' papers and have a wine writers' collection that's as desirable for researchers and as respected as these literary collections, say, at the Harry Ransom Center. And I actually, that Ransom Center's name came up a few times because there was almost this competitive, one of them had a friend whose papers were at the Harry Ransom Center, and they almost had this drive, like, we need to make this what that is. And that's sort of what it takes to create these new collecting focuses and to create these literary markets. There isn't yet a market for wine manuscripts from wine writers, but it's cool to see how that might one day form. It's been very exciting to see a part of this project because it's something entirely new. So with their donations, the wine writers' collection started to garner more attention at home and abroad, and turned what had previously been a regional collection into a collection without strict geographic boundaries. Though the California wine industry was and remains at the center of this collection's focus. But I will say that Johnson and Robinson both had ties to California, and Hugh Johnson especially was one of the first European wine writers who was openly curious about California wines and who wrote about their value and potential before most British wine drinkers were even thinking about California wines as an option. Here's what he says in the Book of California Wine. The concept of wine quality can be considered quite separately from membership of the classical elite. A truly vigorous, well-balanced, satisfying, and long-lived wine is often made right outside the classical traditions, and vice versa. Wines we call great and unanimously agree in appreciating are usually those that combine intrinsic quality with classical idiom. That's so interesting, and I like, what does he mean there? California is still asking itself whether these two recurrent themes are necessarily complementary or even necessarily compatible. The question being asked is whether, let us say, California Pinot Noir should be judged by how far it resembles Côte d'Or wine or Riesling, by how clearly it evokes the Rhine or the Moselle. The answer is no. It should be judged for its qualities in isolation. But the real-life answer is that comparisons will be made. The problem is that having adopted a classic model, it is extraordinarily difficult to set it aside in making judgments. California wine has always stood in relation to European wines and has also at the same time been entirely Californian. Johnson and Robinson understood this and wrote about it, and their papers are critical to understanding the development of the California wine industry, in large part because they were writing from across the ocean. Their donations attracted the attention of Warren Winiarski, a vintner who had entered the wine industry later in his life after a career in academia at the University of Chicago. Winiarski had learned how to make wine from books. He had started out as a home winemaker and eventually gotten in touch with a winemaker in Maryland who was also a newspaper man, and asked for this winemaker to introduce him to people in California. He ultimately made his way to California, and he studied and apprenticed with winemakers like Robert Mondavi and Andre Chellis-Jeff, who is known as the Dean of California winemakers, before he planted his own Cabernet Sauvignon vines. His very first vintage, made with grapes from those vines, won the top score for red wines in a blind bicentennial tasting in Paris in 1976. This tasting, called the Judgment of Paris by the press, changed the way the world viewed California and California wine. The people who hosted the event were Stephen Spurrier, the British owner of a wine school and shop in Paris, and Patricia Gallagher, his American colleague. And the judges who tasted the wines were some of France's most expert and respected wine tasters. They thought that they had given the scores to French wines and were pretty upset when they realized that actually they'd given their top scores to American wines. And there was one member of the press present, George Tabor. He was the only reporter who had not turned down the assignment, because all the other reporters were sure that the French wines would win. And Tabor only went because he didn't have anything else to do that day. Everyone else thought it would be a waste of time. But he was reporting for Time magazine, and he understood the weight that this story could potentially have. So after the event, he quickly finished and filed his story, and Time headlined it, "The Judgment of Paris." And he had ended the piece with this priceless quote from Jim Barrett, the owner of Chateau Montelena, whose wine had received the top score in the whites category. And that was not bad for kids from the sticks. None of the Napa winemakers thought that this story would become as big as it did at the time. Napa was still very rustic in the 70s. And there was a sense of self-respect. People knew that they were making wines that could stand up to European wines, but they hadn't needed this international feedback and affirmation. So Winiarski understood on a very deep personal level and for different reasons how important writing has been for the California wine industry. And he understood the power of the archive, of the museum, and of the historical record that's preserved and sanctified by the institution that keeps it. He decided to give the UC Davis Library a $3.3 million gift to collect the papers of wine writers, winemakers, and historians whose writing about wine had either influenced or documented critical advances in the evolution of this state's industry. That gift supported my position, and I joined the library to plan and grow its wine writers collection and program. So over the last 3 years, my work has largely focused on manuscript collections. We've brought in the papers of many other writers and publishers, including Ruth Ellen Church, largely and surprisingly forgotten by many, but she was actually the first syndicated wine columnist in North America, and she wrote for the Chicago Tribune. We brought in the papers of Gail Unselman, who published the quarterly Wayward Tendrils for book collectors and wine lovers, and Dorothy Gator and John Brutcher, who founded the Wall Street Journal's wine column and made wine accessible to anybody with half an inclination to drink it. We acquired the papers of Gerald Asher, whose eloquence among living wine writers is unmatched, except maybe by Hugh Johnson. And we brought in the notebooks that James Conaway filled when he was researching and writing his best-selling Napa trilogy, the books that opened the doors of the region to a large audience beyond California. Most recently, we've added to the collection the papers of Karen McNeil, author of the Wine Bible, a fat, fact-filled text that just came out in its 3rd edition. I also just want to talk a little bit more about a collection that has grown within the Wine Writers Collection. We've started to collect the papers of people who were involved in the Judgment of Paris, the 1976 tasting. One of those people is Joanne Dupuis, who owned an international tours business in Napa in the 1970s. She was instrumental in early planning for the tasting and was responsible for actually getting the wines to California. So she's another person that people have forgotten about or don't typically associate with the tasting, who was pretty foundational to allowing it to happen. Let's see. At the time of the tasting, she was chaperoning a tour of France's vineyards led by Andrei Chelichev. And the tour was for Napa Valley vintners, and it was during this tour that Jim Barrett learned that his wine had bested the other whites in the tasting. So there is a lot about this event that has become apocryphal. There's a lot that people misstate or misunderstand about what actually happened. There was a movie made called Bottle Shock that tends to be it's typically what people, especially young people, think about when they think about the Judgment of Paris, which is really too bad because it is a story that is so deeply ingrained in the state's sense of itself, not just of the wine it produces. It's one of the great California stories. We also got this fat envelope of articles, letters from Stephen Spurrier that is, so far as I've seen, one of the most incredible and complete and multi-dimensional presentations of this tasting. There's so much in there that I hadn't known about, and that actually directly contradicts a lot of what is most popularly circulated as the happenings of that event. So we're hoping that this Wine Writers Collection spawns other nodal collections like this Judgment of Paris collection. This, I think, is one of the real gifts of the Wine Writers Collection, is that there are these fundamental evolutionary threads in our state's wine industry's lifetime. And they're not black and white, and they're not straightforward. And being able to have different writers' accounts of what happened, as well as their primary sources, is just really wonderful and important. So while my focus has been on contemporary manuscript collections, my colleagues and I have continued to add rare books and manuscripts to the collection that demonstrate some of the earliest forms of wine writing and reporting. Two of our most important acquisitions in this area have been a bifolium in Latin from the library of the gastronomer and wine writer Andre Simone, whom wine writer Hugh Johnson called the charismatic leader of the English wine trade for almost all of the first half of the 20th century, and the grand old man of literate connoisseurship for a further 20 years. Last week, we had the incredible luck of receiving a $38,000 grant from the Breslauer Foundation. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with this foundation. This is their last year operating, and we had applied for this grant to purchase a book that is the first book in French about wine. It's a debate between water and wine, published in 1515, and this book was being sold by Ben Kinmont for more money than we could afford. And so I hadn't known about the B.H. Breslauer Foundation, but a colleague passed their name along to me, and this was the easiest grant I've ever applied for. And it was just like a dream to get this money. So I just felt like I will never have an experience. This is such an old school experience. And I'm really disappointed that they're not going to continue to operate. But I know that they've allowed a lot of other libraries to purchase important books, and to get some of these books into public institutions is just incredibly important. So this is the first time this book is going to be in a public institution. It's just been in private hands up to this point. The library's rare book collection also holds many of the earliest books about wine published in English. We have Sir Edward Barry's observations, historical, critical, and medical, on the wines of the ancients and the analogy between them and the modern wines from 1775. And Alexander Henderson's A History of Ancient and Modern Wines from 1824, as well as The Juice of the Grape, or Wine Preferable to Water, written by Peter Shaw and printed in 1724. What we don't have, and would really like, is the first book on wine in the English language. And that's a new book of the natures and properties of all wines, written by William Turner and printed in 1568. This book is thought to have been a guide for William Shakespeare, who laced his texts with numerous references to wine. So we are keeping an eye out for that one, if you have any leads. There's a lot more I could say about the collection, but I think it's time to bring this talk to a close. So as I start to wrap up, I just want to say a little bit about how I came to this work and what continues to motivate me. People who work in special collections spend a lot of time looking backward, but we also think a lot about the future of the profession. And as my fellowship at the UC Davis Library comes to a close and the Wine Writers Collection is set to launch into the next phase of its life, I've been thinking more about the spirit that compels us to search for, collect, and document history. Prior to joining UC Davis, I worked at the Harry Ransom Center, and before that, I was an editor of the Oxford American Magazine. It's a literary magazine based in Arkansas. I came to the world of literary collections in part because I was interested in the creative process, but on the other hand, my work at the magazine, while I was working at the magazine, I got to know a lot of collectors and people who were obsessed with the blues. And in the world of blues, there's this group of people called the Blues Mafia, and they will really home in on an artist or a lost recording and go to great lengths to track down the family of the artist, or it's pretty incredible. Like, this is real super nerdy, but one of the collectors was known to have written a book about Robert Johnson, one of the most important and elusive blues musicians. And he had never published this manuscript, but it was supposed to have all kinds of secret, unknown information, including about Robert Johnson's murderer. So this book had achieved this mythic, like, holy grail, like, status, because the collector was so jealously possessive of the manuscript. It's just interesting. Anyway, I got to know him, and one night I visited him, and we stayed up talking late into the night, and I ended up spending the night. And he lived in Houston, I lived in Austin, and I didn't want to drive home. And a few days later, he told me that I had been in the room with the manuscript. whether or not he was lying or telling the truth, like that had a profound effect on my imagination. And I wondered at the sanctity of stories and the lives they portrayed and the profound lengths that people will go to collect these stories and this information and knowledge. I didn't understand it myself at the time, and I had no inkling that I'd one day work with collections in the way that I do now. But years later, I found that sense of mystery and passion of the collector's instinct magnified 100-fold at the Harry Ransom Center, where Harry Hunt Ransom's collecting genius or compulsion echoed in every corner of the stacks. It was pretty infectious. And I just get 2 more minutes. So a week ago, I met with a student who'd taken an undergraduate course that I taught in special collections in fall of 2019. At the time, the student had been on a pre-med track, but the readings sparked ideas for her, and she was often one of the most engaged students in the class. It was clear, too, that she was energized by the collections. She now wanted to be a librarian, she told me when we met, or a high school teacher. And she tells her friends, you need to walk through the glass doors by the display cases on the first floor of the library. You won't believe what's behind those doors. The excitement that I saw in her reminded me of what I had felt in my early 20s and what I often still feel when I walk the stacks. I see it in many students who take classes with my colleague, Christine Chang, who will speak next. And I'm so excited and delighted for what they still have to discover, and I'm so curious to know where their paths will take them. So thank you. Yes.
Are your acquisitions purchases or gifts or both?
Well, with rare books and manuscripts, those are almost always purchases, but the manuscript collections are all gifts. Yes.
Where on campus is the archive held?
It's at Shields Library. Yeah.
Do you have any papers from Georgia?
Yes, we have. I have actually gotten to know his wife very well, and she donated a collection that covers the course of his career and even has some correspondence related to when he came to America. It's really cool. Yeah.
Do you have any programming into the collection?
We do. We had a huge wine writers event in 2020, and the library has a partnership with the Robert Mondavi Institute, and we do programs together. We do 2 to 3 a year, usually around food and wine, food and drink topics. Yes?
I'm at a sister institution, UCLA, in special collections. I'm wondering, with the drinking age going back up to 21, and sometimes a prohibitionistic zeal among some students and families and so forth, you get pushback on the collections saying that either you should also be collecting the other side of the coin, or do you already do that?
We do that. We have a temperance collection. Christine, do you want to? I did teach this undergraduate research class that I taught was on the wine collections, and I did get pushback about that class, which was interesting. But UC Davis has, it's a world-renowned viticulture and enology program, so usually we can kind of point to that. Yeah.
Any other questions? And Jullianne, if you could if we do have any other questions, if you could speak into the mic, or perhaps Jullianne could repeat the question. We are recording this and live streaming, and so we want to be able to be sure that others are able to hear the question as well as the answer. Thank you. So with that, any other questions, anybody?
Yes.
Ms.
Yeah, so she asked if somebody can get on the mailing list to get notified about the Savor Lecture Series, the partnership between the library and the Robert Mondavi Institute. And I believe you can. Yes. Axel, do you want to?
Can you say what the next program? Can you say what the next program is, because you're one of the organizers of it, and that anybody can sign up for it. This one's going to be Zoom, and they are also recorded. The past ones are available for watching. But
Yeah, the next lecture is going to be on beer, and we've invited a malt house and a brewery from Albuquerque to talk about the hyper-local, super-local ingredients that they use to make their malt and their beers. The brewery is Bow and Arrow Brewery, based in Albuquerque, and the malt house is Admiral Maltings in Alameda. Yes. Who is that? Dr. Lewis? Michael Lewis. He asked if Michael Lewis would be involved in this program. Actually, the new professor he's not really new anymore, Glenn Fox, will be involved. I think Michael Lewis is still in Davis, but he's no longer at the university. Okay, any more? All right, thank you so much for staying and listening. Really appreciate it.